certainly hope this little incident hasn't put you off flying, miss. Statistically speaking, of course, it's still the safest way to travel.
Let's go. But inconspicuously. Through the window.
And here we go. We are gonna get through this as a family.
Superman and Lois, season premiere Tuesday, March 14th. Free next day on the CW app.
So let's talk a little bit about the new season of Superman and Lois, which premieres on March 14th. It's no secret that I love this show. And really, despite the differences from the comics, notably the fact that Lois and Clark only have one biological child there, not the twins of the TV series, it's consistently amazing to me just how much this show feels like it's perfectly aligned with the current era of the character in the comics. It's a weird thing, too, because that isn't always the case with Superman live action adaptations, which are sometimes a little out of step with their moment. The movie serial of 1948 was the first live action Superman, and it's more or less aligned with what fans would have found if they picked up an issue of Action Comics or Superman at the time. But the Adventures of Superman TV series, which followed a few years later in the early 1950s, felt far more like the stripped down social justice, crime-focused Superman comics of the late 1930s and early 1940s. George Reeves' Superman has far more in common with the character as he appeared in those earliest stories and in the early radio shows than he does with the extremely science fiction, kind of bonkers Superman comics of the 1950s. Even the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, especially the first two, are of a slightly different feel from the comics of the late 70s and early 80s. And they ended up influencing the character's 1986 comics reboot rather than taking their cues from the character as he was currently appearing in the comics of the time. Funny enough, it was the Superboy TV series of the late 80s that felt a lot more like the comics of the 70s and early 80s, but that's a story for another time. You really have to look at 1993's Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman TV show, to find the next live-action adaptation that was directly taking its cues from the comics of its era. I know, this show isn't for everyone, but the first season especially is really great, and you should definitely check it out. Hell, even Man of Steel felt like it was taking even more inspiration from the John Byrne comics of the mid-1980s than anything that was going on in the comics of 2013 when that movie came out. But Superman and Lois is something else. Yes, it isn't really a faithful adaptation of the Superman comics since John Kent was introduced, but spiritually it sure is. And they absolutely nail the family dynamic between Clark, Lois, Jordan, and Jonathan, while simultaneously paying homage to practically every era of the character. There's always deep-cut references in this show, and it's very clear that the showrunners and the writers' room really know and love their Superman lore. Anyway, all of this is to say that the first two episodes of Superman and Lois Season 3 continue with all of this. But the reason I bring up the comics parallels in particular is because if you've been reading recent issues of Action Comics, you know just how overtly horny Lois and Clark have been for each other lately. The season premiere of Superman and Lois is very much in keeping with this vibe, and it's kind of refreshing to see, especially in contrast to how sexless something like the MCU always is. I can't really say much else about these first two episodes because of spoilers, but I will say that these are somewhat low-key, but they're heavy on the dramatic elements. Don't worry, though. Each one features some terrific action as well, and honestly, Tyler Hoechlin has never looked better in the Superman suit. And yes, for the curious, Michael Bishop is really solid as the new Jonathan Kent. I feel like it might take a little while to get those real brotherly vibes that we got from Jordan Elsis and Alex Garfin in the first two seasons, but these things take time, and I think Michael is off to a great start as John. Come back in 2 weeks because I will have my interview with co-showrunners Todd Helbing and Brent Fletcher to dive into some spoilers about the new season of Superman and Lois. Don't forget to check out our web home at denofgeek.com, where you can find all our DC coverage at denofgeek.com/DC. Make sure you are following at DC Standom on Twitter and Instagram. Give those a follow. Tell us what you want to hear about in upcoming episodes. Thanks again to our sponsor, Outright Games and Justice League Cosmic Chaos. Head over to outrightgames.com for more info on this fun new game. And hey, did you know that we also have a Marvel show? That's right. You can also listen to Marvel Standom wherever you're listening to this show right now. Check it out. Sometimes we do our Standoms live. Well, most of the time, if we're talking about Marvel Standom. So make sure you're following Den of Geek on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/DenofGeekTV. And on YouTube, youtube.com/DenofGeekUS. This has been DC Standom on the Den of Geek Network. Until next time, remember, folks, we stand together.